Steve Schwarm, W3EVE, and I've been licensed since 1962 when I was in high school. I got the call KN1VQG. I was living in New England at the time, Massachusetts, actually. The same year, I earned my Eagle Scout, and scouting was a very important part of my life. And even as an adult, I've been involved in it. But one of the things that's interesting about scouting in those days in particular is that you actually learned a Morse code. So when I found out about ham radio, I didn't have to go and learn the Morse code because I already knew it. And I had a colleague in high school who gave me the novice test, and that started my career in ham radio as well. And I've been active in it in high school and in college and even after as time went on. And then when I graduated from college, I moved to Delaware and got the really cool call of W3EVE. Somebody must have been awake at the FCC. Back in those days, your call letter number had to match your call area. So I had to have that call sign. And I kept it as long as I lived in Delaware and Pennsylvania. And then when I moved back to Massachusetts, I kept it because in those days you could keep the call sign even if it wasn't correct. I'm an almost retired electronics engineer and a software engineer. I sort of got started purely as an electronics engineer working for the DuPont company, and then got involved in factory automation and became much more involved in software, and sort of have done both of them. As I like to say, I'm a software engineer that actually knows how the computer hardware works. I'm a life member of the ARRL, and I've been at several section level positions, a technical coordinator. I was an SEC for a while, and then and now I'm a DEC. I led one of the first groups of hams invited into New York City after 9/11. And I volunteer in other events. The head of the Charles Regatta and the New England Forest Rally, which is a crazy high-speed race, car race in the woods of Maine and northern New Hampshire on logging roads. It's pretty wild. And all the communications is done by ham radio. So let's talk about the Boston Marathon. It's the longest running marathon. It's been run every year since 1897, except in 2020. And it's run on Patriots Day. And that's actually April 19th is the anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which is viewed by most as the actual start of the Revolutionary War. And it's a Massachusetts state holiday. It's now on the Monday nearest April 19th, so it's treated like a Monday holiday all the time now. And one thing that most people don't know about the Boston Marathon is it's not a legal marathon. And that basically means that if you set a world record speed for a marathon running the Boston Marathon, you do not get the world record for it. So it's still a very highly desired one for people to run and participate in the Olympic world, in the marathon world. And if you talk to any marathoners, the Boston Marathon is at least 2 entries in their top 10 things they want to do about marathoning. One of them is just to run it, and the second one is to finish it. Most of them don't even think they'll ever worry about being first or setting a record with it, but it's a highly desired event to participate in. And what makes it not legal is the fact it's run in a straight line. And most marathons, in order to be a legal marathon, the start and the finish have to be within a certain distance of each other. And as a result, they end up being in circles or some zigzag patterns. I know the New York Marathon is run in a zigzag pattern. And one of the problems with it being in a straight line is it means communications is much more difficult. The New York Marathon, which I've worked on a couple of times, is all communicated from a small number of repeaters located in the center of the city of New York. And that is real easy to do. Of course, they have the advantage of some very tall buildings to put those repeaters on too. So it runs through 8 separate towns or cities, each of which has their own medical transport system. For people that aren't from the New England area, Massachusetts in particular, but most of New England is like this as well, is that all the communities in Massachusetts, all the land in Massachusetts is either part of a town or a city. There is no unincorporated land like there is in the Midwest and other places in the country. So everything's part of a town, and each town has its own government. And the town I live in is actually run by town meeting. So all registered voters get to vote at the town meetings and help run the government. It sometimes works very well and sometimes can be a little bit of a pain in the neck, but it's interesting. So it's fascinating how it works. So I've been working on the Boston Marathon annually since 1995 and did it several times before, but it's been continuous since 1995. And I was asked to run the course communications in 2001 by the person who was in charge of the Red Cross first aid stations on the marathon. I retired from that leadership position after the 2014 marathon, but I still work it every year. Okay, so let's talk about how the ham communications is organized. The communications is divided into 3 groups. There's the start, and they handle all the communication, they handle all the bus traffic that's delivering all the runners from Boston. What they have is a whole bunch of all the school buses in the area. It's a state holiday, so there's no school. So they get all the school buses they can to take the runners from the start in the Boston center of Boston out to the end in Boston to the start in Hopkinton. And then they can bring some equipment with them and get used to the environment out there, and then they can leave that equipment on the bus and pick it up when they finish the course. The start uses several repeaters, but a single repeater, but does a lot of simplex communications because most of it's within a mile or 2 of the start itself. The course handles communications with one on each side of the road. So there's actually 2 times 26 fluid stations, and they're spaced evenly along the course every mile. There are also special fluid stations for the elite runners, which are located at specific locations as well, but we don't supply communications for those. We also supply communications for the 26 first aid stations, and they are distributed more on a demand basis in that they're fairly far apart in the beginning of the course and get much closer together towards the end. We also manage the course bus system, which is used to pick up runners that are not able to finish the event but do not need to be taken to a hospital. It's just could be any one of things, to a simple cramp or just being too exhausted. The ambulance dispatching is handled through a 800 megahertz system to the Massachusetts Emergency Headquarters, which is in Framingham, Massachusetts, and is a couple miles from the course itself. That is where ambulances are dispatched to the first aid stations from the various towns that the first aid stations are in. We use 7 repeaters to cover 7 different pieces of the course. And there's also a set of linked repeaters that cover the entire course and the start as well. And then there are 2 other repeaters that are used to talk to the buses. Because the course is on the roads, and the way it's set up, it basically divides that part of the state through the course. There's only three places that the course can be crossed during the marathon. So we have all the buses on one side of the course on one repeater, and all the buses on the other side of the course on a different repeater. We also have a backup net control that few people knew about, but it was something that I thought would be very important. A separate small team of people that have all the same frequency knowledge and know what's going on pretty well and are available through the telephone system can replace us if our net control gets into trouble. The finish handles communications between the 2 medical tents and with the buses as well. It also supplies other services at the finish. The most involved one is wheelchairs. When runners finish the Boston Marathon, they often can't walk anymore if they stop running, and they get picked up by wheelchairs and moved around. And they use simplex and crossband repeat, and and 2 repeaters as well. And one of the most interesting examples of that is one of the facilities for dealing with minor medical issues is in the second level basement of one of the hotels right there at the finish line. And the state police are always amazed that the ham radio operators have no problems communicating down there, but because none of their radios work down there. And that's because one of the guys parks his truck on the street right above the hotel and has a crossband repeater in it. And that's how he talks from his HT out to the rest of the people. So it's one of the pieces of technology when you're involved in any kind of these activities, and even during emergencies, it's very powerful, is to have the ability to do crossband repeat. So here's the staffing layout. The start had 50 hams at the start, along with several hundred other volunteers to manage the runners. The course, we have 3 hams at each first aid station, 15 to 25 first aid EMTs, and 1 MD at each first aid station. The first aid stations are Foxtrot 01 Alpha through Foxtrot 26 Charlie, and each ham is assigned a letter A, B, or C, depending upon which one of the 3 they are. The fluid stations have 1 ham and one or 2 first aid people and 10 to 15 volunteers, and they use Whiskey 01 Lima for left and Whiskey 26 Romeo for right. The buses have 1 ham and 1 first aider and a driver, and they're all Bravos. The net control has about 30 hams and 5 Red Cross support people. And we always get the cool 1-by-1 call, world's #1 marathon for the event. And that makes it easy for everybody to remember net control's call sign. The finish line has 2 first aid stations, which are staffed by EMTs, nurses, and at least 1 MD in each one of them. There's normally like 3 or 4 of them. There are about 50 hams there that shadow the staff. They manage the buses, help at the first aid stations with communications and communications between the wheelchair teams. Each wheelchair team has 1 ham radio operator. There's over 250 amateur radio operators involved in the event. And this is a picture of net control. And one of the things that's interesting about how it's laid out is each one of the operators that you see at the table here is running one of the nets. They're the net control operator for that net. And the reason why we lay it out this way is that we can then have runners pass information between the net control operators by literally running around this table. You see up in the upper left-hand corner is a display, and that's where we manage the buses. And the buses are run out of that location. And the nice thing about this location is it's not right on the course. It's actually a couple miles from the course. It's on one of the highest hills in the area. And we can get into every single repeater that we use from that site with a 2-watt HT. The other thing we do at Net Control here is we do not transmit on 2 meters, with one exception, me. I'm allowed to transmit on 2 meters. And we use 2 meters primarily for all the repeater output and input frequencies on the course. So all the radios here are using typically 440 or 220 to talk to their repeaters, and are connected such that they can do that. And that gives the net control the ability to override any signals that are coming into the repeater that are undesired, somebody sitting on a microphone or something like that. And it literally happens at every single event that somebody sits on a microphone or has their microphone in such a way they accidentally hit transmit every once in a while. But this gives you an idea of what our net control facility looks like. The medical support has evolved a lot over the time that I've been involved in it. In 2004, we had weather warmer than expected. And the original thought was that there would be a sea breeze, which means there would be water blowing westerly from the ocean, and that would cool everybody off, and it didn't happen. And we had we had 196 runners that were sent to the hospital from overheating primarily. And as a result, we filled up all the emergency rooms in all the cities and hospitals in the immediate area, and there's quite a few of them. And we actually had to get ambulances from southern New Hampshire and far western Massachusetts to support the activities. So the next year they made 4 first aid stations were upgraded to field hospitals, which was the first time that we actually had an MD at those first aid stations. Prior to that, all of them were staffed purely with EMTs. In 2012, we had a similar event. And after that, all the first aid stations were upgraded to include things like cooling baths, and defibrillators were added. An MD was staffed at every first aid station. And there were some similar changes at the finish as well. There were more MDs at the finish line. And we also added the first aiders at the fluid station on that year. The other thing we had done is we realized that there might be a time when we had to shut down the course. It actually happened at another marathon, and I think it was in Chicago, where they had a problem with a thunderstorm coming through with lightning. So we said, gee, we ought to come up with some places along the course where we can take the runners and get them out of the elements. And we also saved 30 of the buses that were not being used for shuttling the people that wouldn't finish to be used in case we had to transport people to these facilities. Because one of the things that happens is when you stop a race like this, the runners, if they don't get a good cool down or something like that, they get stiff and they really can't walk well, let alone run. So you have to be prepared to transport them. So what happened in 2013? That was 10 years ago. Yeah, a lot of celebrations about how that changed the world of marathoning in general and the Boston Marathon in specific. The main race started in waves starting at 10 a.m. The wheelchairs and some of the other less ambulatory runner involved in the course get to start earlier, but the primary event starts at 10 and they leave in waves every 20 minutes. And there were about 25,000 registered runners on that event. At about 2:49 p.m., a bomb was exploded on the course a few blocks west of the finish line. And shortly thereafter, another one went off 2 blocks further west. Paul Topolsky, WNSEX, was the leader at the finish line. He had my role at the finish line communications, called me on the radio. We had our own private frequency that we used through a repeater at Boston University. And he called me on the radio and said, call my cell stat. And he virtually never uses that term. It took me 5 tries before I got through, which was not unusual at those times to have that kind of a problem. They do have their own cell phone switch at the finish line. And we were quite a ways away from the course, so we didn't have any trouble getting cell phone coverage at course net control. But it did take 5 tries before I got through. He told me about the explosion. And at that time, they didn't know they were bombs. They just had 2 explosions. They originally thought they were just a gas explosions. And he told me that the BAA, the Boston Athletic Association, which is the organization that runs the Boston Marathon, basically our customer, said to say nothing about it until the public safety communications had it sent to its staff in the field. Well, the public safety frequencies were pure chaos. It took over 20 minutes for the public safety to get the message through to the people on the course. Now, there's multiple reasons for that, but one of them is that there were 8 separate public safety plus the state public safety involved in that communications. So that in itself took time to do. And then for it to get passed on down. The other thing that's true of public safety is that they don't have the concept of net control. The dispatchers are not equivalent to net control because they are actually sources and sinks of information, and that's their only mission. Whereas net control is solely responsible for managing the frequency. And like the military, public safety is managed by rank. If the fire chief wants to talk, the fire chief talks. And a lot of that was part of the problem. I think it was just in general very poor management of the frequencies and applying appropriate precedents to it. And the fact that there were 8 separate cities or towns involved doesn't make it even any easier. So, of course, I was at course net control, and I told everyone what we knew. And at that time, we only knew that there was 2 explosions. We didn't know that they were actually bombs, but not to announce it on the air. One of the net controls, Jim KB1 KQW, did announce on his frequency, which is at the end of the course, is that this frequency is now for emergency traffic only, which kind of gave all the hams out in the field a hint that something was going wrong. 5,600 runners were stopped on the course, about 2,000 of which were at the last first aid station, which is about a third of a mile from the finish. The course at that time was declared a crime scene by the city and state police. Part of the problem that has is they wanted to get rid of everybody that wasn't a police officer or an EMT or some other officer position like that. And initially they were going to kick all the amateurs out until all the first aid people said, you can't, because they're our communications facility. So that's one thing is, as volunteers in these kinds of situations, we need to be aware of, is that the initial reaction by public safety with volunteers is to not include them unless they are clearly have some important role. At the finish line, 3 people were killed by the explosions that day, but over 260 people were wounded, many of which were treated at the finish line, and most were sent to the hospital, which saved many, many lives. What a lot of people don't realize, and I don't think the majority of the people that participate in the Boston Marathon realized until that day, is that the first aid stations on the course and the first aid stations at the finish line are well staffed with people very knowledgeable in what they're doing, and were basically emergency rooms. In fact, the finish line even had an X-ray machine and some other facilities that aren't normally the kind of thing you expect in that kind of a field operation. But we, as amateur radio operators, supplied the primary communications at the finish line during all that activity. And of course, we were doing the communications on the course at that time as well. On the course, Katie Finch, who was in charge of the first aid for the whole course, had Rob Macedo, KD1CY, as his shadow, and they were located at Heartbreak Hill, which is the place I get to be most times since I've retired from my leadership position. They opened shelters for the runners at those emergency locations that we had set aside in case we had bad weather, and mostly to keep them warm, because the weather was perfect for running, but not for standing still after you've been running, and the runners were getting very cold. We even used volunteers' cars to warm the runners, and the buses were used to move some of the runners to Boston, as well as a bus would often be hijacked to keep runners warm as well. And most of the runners found their own way home of the 5,600 that hadn't finished. One of our friends was running the marathon, and my wife picked him up along the Charles River, which was about, I guess it's about 1.5 miles, 2 miles away from the finish line. So it took until about 6:30 to shut down operations at course net control. Several of the hams from the finish came to net control to help after they finished up. Okay, there have been several changes in the operation since 2014, after I retired. The hams there are now 2 hams per first aid station. Professionals do the communications for ambulance dispatching at the first aid stations through commercial rental radios or state radios. The hams supply report status every hour, and the hams are the backup communications. And the reality is our system always works, and they always have problems. Every year, there's somebody that has trouble with the commercial radios. And we always seem to have trouble too, but it's not serious because we have enough redundancy and backup. Some other important things I've learned through doing all the fun events that I've done, like the Boston Marathon and being in New York City after 9/11, is use name tags and first names only as necessary. Best way to get somebody's attention is to call their name. And it's amazing how well that works. So it's important when you get on site to have a name tag that's got your name on it. In fact, what we used in New York City is they used duct tape and a magic marker, and on your chest, on your left chest and on your back, they had a duct tape with your name on it when you're a ham radio operator. And that way they could tell you were a ham radio operator and supplying communications, but they also knew your name so they could get your attention. You should get some training, take the MCOM courses. When I was SEC. That was one of the things I got started, was the idea of having these MCOM courses over and above just traffic handling courses, which was all they were teaching at that time. But that's where some of those got started. And then, of course, the FEMA courses, particularly 100 and 200 and NIMS, are good to know. Another thing that's very powerful, we use this a lot in New York City after 9/11, and we've used it in several other cases, is to use message forms. And it's not so much that you have to use that forms in its entirety to communicate it over the air, but it's a great way to note something that you then have to give to somebody that's not a ham, or even somebody who is a ham, to remember it. One of the occurrences, when I was in New York City after 9/11, one of the jobs I had was at the new Red Cross headquarters, which was set up in a school they had an office in there, and most of the school was empty, and that's where they set up their new headquarters. And I can remember there was a lot of trouble with keeping track of things and what was going on. And I'd gotten a message in the morning about a particular thing needing some specific help at one of the shelters that we were staffing with the Red Cross. And I took the message and handed it to the people down there that were dealing with it. And about 3 hours later, I got a call from that, said they haven't gotten that information yet. And I went down to find out what was to verify that they knew it. And they said, well, we don't remember anything about it. And I said, it's right there on that message in front of you. And it was one of these cases where somebody put something on top of it or something like that, and it just got misplaced. But it means that they actually had a record for doing that. The other thing that I find very important is that people should learn how to do phonetic spelling, and they should use the standard phonetic alphabet. And what a lot of people don't realize is that's the one that people who do air traffic control use as well. And the reason for that is that it's something that, no matter what your native language is something that you can understand. And also, you can sometimes get really surprised at what some advanced planning can do for you. And our example there was having shelters along the course with the intent of them being used if we had a thunderstorm come through. But we ended up using them to keep the runners warm when we had to shut down the course. Another thing that most of the professionals do not understand or appreciate, in fact, a lot of hams don't appreciate, the significance and the uniqueness of the concept of net control. At the Boston Marathon, we have our control center, where the advantage there is that we can actually use paper or actually talk to each other to communicate between different parts of the course. But in New York City, the net controls were actually located at their home or at a business not close to where all of our activity was, but at a good range of the repeaters we were using. And the real advantage they had is they got a decent meal. They got 4 hours. They were 4 hours on before, and they got a whole day off before they had to go on again, where we were on 12-hour shifts that really turned more like 20-hour shifts. So they were always wide awake and alert. And all they did is manage the frequency. And they could do things like take simple notes for us when we were not in a position to do a good thing to relay on to somebody else and that kind of thing. So that's another thing to think about, is net control does not have to be at the site. You will want to have people at the site, but you don't have to have net control there. Okay, thank you very much. I'd be glad to hang around for questions. One thing I like to put up on every net control site that I run since I've been in New York is the saying I saw at White Plains, New York, Red Cross Center on September 16, 2001. Blessed are the flexible, for they shall not be bent out of shape. I think sort of sets the goal that we try to meet with amateur radio in those kinds of facilities. Okay, I'm willing to take questions, comments.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Steve. That was good.
Question is, how was the eventual net control location determined? I know it's been in the same place for a long, long time, but how was that determined to place the net control where it was?
Can you answer that?
It's located at a school that's in Brookline, but it's about 3 or 4 miles away, and it's on top of a hill. So it's a great location to be net control.
And it's been there how many years? How many years have they been using the school?
Well, it's been at that location since 2005.
Okay, so it's been a while.
After the 2004 craziness, we realized we really had to have a better location.
Okay. And Victor wants to know, are the hams trained in crime scene protection?
No, we don't do anything with timekeeping.
So
they've got that all automated now. All the hams, all the runners have devices on that sense their presence when they pass the various checkpoints. And you can actually keep track of a runner. If you know somebody that's running and you know their bib number, you can track them with an app that they have on the phone.
Okay. How about crime scene protection?
Say that again.
Crime scene protection. Is there any training in that since it all of a sudden became a crime scene?
Police and involved in what's going on all along the course. So, and in fact, people are not allowed on the course starting about, 8:30 in the morning. And they have it all blocked off.
Normally they wouldn't.
They even put big trucks and things like that on the cross streets to keep people from being able to drive a truck or something or a vehicle across.
Okay, well, that's all.
It wasn't like that when I started, but
Victor, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Now, good afternoon. Can you hear me out here?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Thank you. The reason for the question on crime scene protection, when you spoke about them wanting to remove the ham radio operators from the course, and then they had to help secure the course, that made them crime scene protecting individuals. So I'm wondering if they got more training, if there's regular training now on what you really need to do about keeping your feet in the right place and not stepping over boundaries and stepping over lines that should not be crossed. There's a very serious protocol for crime scene protection that I don't think most people have and understand without proper training. And that's why I'm wondering if they advanced that because of this incident. Thank you.
No, they haven't done anything quite like that. And I think the primary reason is that there are a lot of police on the course on that day. So if there is a crime scene situation, there are police there. The other thing that's true is they actually have fences that protect the course from people going onto it all along, with police there to enforce it. And the only real place there was a crime scene was the last 4 blocks of the course. There wasn't any crime scene outside of that, with 2 minor exceptions. They had to blow up what they thought was a bomb near the library in Boston. And then there was another one that was a package that a backpack that was not identified by anybody. They were about ready to blow it up and somebody identified it as theirs. One of the things that they've done is they require us, if we have a backpack, to have one that's clear so you can see everything that's in it.
Okay, I don't see more hands up. How are we doing in the chat there, Barry?
We're up to date in chat.
Dan, go ahead if you're wanting to speak.
I was a little stymied because at the time the Boston Marathon bombing happened, Unified Command had been part of NIMS for about a decade.
Yeah.
You
we
gotta
won't get
understand
into
the
that. Part of the problem is that really there wasn't any real heavy involvement by the state operations center until 2012. I mean, before that, well, I guess it was 2004. They was the first, after that, 2005 was the first time they started to really have pay any real attention to it as a state emergency management facility. They weren't involved in it at all until after 2004. And then it was not even the state necessarily that was involved. There's a separate organization of volunteers that are used to set up emergency facilities, and they were using it as a practice to set up those 4 first aid stations as emergency hospitals. And since then, each first aid station has become essentially emergency hospital. There's at least one MD, and there's all kinds of extra equipment like cooling baths, and we had ice available to us and stuff like that. So a lot has changed since then.
You got to understand the politics of Massachusetts and how the city of Boston fits in with the state, and it's incredibly complicated. Like if there are no county governments. Well, there are county governments. The county governments do the jails and the courts, and that's it. Each individual city and town has their own emergency manager. Each city and town has their own police chief. Each city and town has their own fire chief. And it can get pretty dicey. The hams just act as liaisons for everybody.
Yeah, I'm muted. I'm sorry about that. Dan, you had your hand back up. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, but we can take Gene's question first.
Okay, go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. Hopefully y'all can hear me.
Yes,
This is Gene, M3XUS from McLean, Texas. Originally from Boston, born and raised, educated down in Texas now. But I was wondering, number one, what were the power supplies used for the radios? Was there a common one? Or was there a common one? And also, was there a common antenna system at each of the stations that had an amateur radio operator at, whether it be an HT or a like a vertical, something like that.
Yeah, what we had for the amateurs was everybody used an HT, and we set up the network of repeaters such that an HT along the course could work the repeater you were assigned to. And that's one of the reasons why it took 7 repeaters to cover the whole course, is that we wanted to make sure that there were actually 2 repeaters that could cover every single location, because, you know, one of them always seems to fail at some point. And we had one this year that didn't work right. It was working fine the day before, but it stopped working on the day of. And we had to use an alternate repeater for that. But and that's one of the things that's different about amateur radio, is that we show up, an amateur that has done this before shows up with at least 2 radios. I tend to bring 3 just because I know the guy that I'm with normally is somebody new at this and might only have 1. And then I have 1 in my car as well. So that's the other thing. And that was true in New York City too. I mean, when I went to New York City, I took 2 HTs and a mobile with a plug-in power supply for it. And that one does crossband repeat. And that's what I used in one of my assignments, where I was in a basement and I couldn't get out with my HT. But as soon as I got the crossband repeater set up, that was loud and clear again.
Okay, so the people operating with the HTs, were they using the rubber duck on it, or were they using some type of external like a mag mount?
Well, they have to be mobile because it's a large area that you're covering. You have to be able to walk around, and you can't be attached to an antenna all the time, because one of the things you have to do sometimes is go down the course to help them with a runner that's down and supply communications for that. So everybody uses an HT. We encourage people to use headphones or earphones at least, and a remote mic so they can leave it hooked on their belt. But we choose the locations and such that you need it better than the rubber duck antenna for sure. We always encourage you not to use just a rubber duck, but a real good antenna. And also, if you have to, you got to take it off the belt and pick it up so it'll work. But one of the reasons why we have as many repeaters is to allow relatively low power repeaters to radios to work. And everybody uses an HT, except of course the people at Net Control.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Great information. Thank you for the answers. I'll be signing off right now, but I'll still be monitoring. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, I'm good at ARRL.net. So W3EVE@ARRLnet.net is a great email address for me.
Yeah. So Steve, there was a lot of overhead and planning, and the places where you would shelter along the route. Where does the funding come for the recurring funding come for the Boston Marathon?
The Boston Marathon itself is very well funded. I believe the runner who finishes first gets $150,000 for doing that, the professional runner. They also charge for people who run the course a fee, an entry fee, and I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's a couple $100. And then we have sponsors that supply a lot of the funding for it and help run the buses and pay for all of that part of the operation. So it has a fair amount of money, but it's involved in what's going on here. But it's also has a very big economic impact, positive economic impact to the Boston area because of all the people that come to watch it. We have close to 1 million people that watch the event along the course in particular. It's quite an interesting one to come watch, especially when you get a good location like the top of Heartbreak Hill or something like that. It's kind of fun to do that. And a lot of people do that. It has good funding. The amateur radio operators get a jacket, and they're pretty nice jackets. I probably should have worn mine, but it's a nice waterproof jacket to identify us as volunteers.
The day after the marathon, the planning starts for the next marathon. It literally takes a year of planning to get ready for the next marathon. There are tons of committee meetings and other meetings and subcommittee meetings, and it takes an awful lot of planning to pull something like this off, and an awful lot of cooperation from a whole bunch of groups like the Red Cross and the HAMS and public safety and emergency medical services and the doctors and the nurses and the hospitals, the buses. It really takes an awful lot of planning to pull something like this off. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yes. No, that's quite true. And one of the things that is interesting, somebody mentioned the whole idea of how the Massachusetts governments work at the state and town level. One of the reasons why Red Cross is put in charge of the course for the first aid stations is precisely that, so that there's one organization that worries about planning it. At some point, somebody realized that was very important for making it a consistent across the board plan. And that's why the Red Cross does it. And they actually have a team that's been doing it for as long as I've been doing it. And it's kind of interesting how that all works. So a lot of the first aid stations have been staffed by the same people for 20 or 30 years.
I'd have a hunch that it's fine-tuned every year as they go forward, learn the lessons from the year before as things change.
Absolutely.
Okay,
And Victor wants to know about, do the hams operate under the NIMS protocols?
huh?
Say that again, please.
Do the hams operate under NIMS protocols?
In theory, but in practice, no. One of the things we do is we do not have a lot of stations on one frequency. So the frequency management is not nearly as big of a problem. And particularly now that we are not doing as much of the traffic as we used to do, that is even less of a problem. But we follow pretty close to what the idea of the NIMS protocol is all about. And we do the priority messaging and stuff like that, all that way. But the number of times we've had real priority traffic is so little that it's not a real issue. But there's a manual that's written up on what you're supposed to be doing and how you're supposed to do it. And it's a little different since I took over, since I stopped doing it, but it still very much follows that.
That's all online somewhere too, if anyone wants to download it, all the documentation.
Yeah, if you send me an email, I can send you a copy.
Okay, one last shout out there. Anybody got any questions? Anything in chat, Barry?
No, we're good. We're all up to date. Thank everybody for coming.